Greetings and welcome to the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. My name is Peter Mandaville, and I'm a senior research fellow here at the center. At Georgetown, I lead the Berkley Center's Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, a multi-year research initiative enabled by generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, dedicated to exploring and understanding the various ways that religion fits into the foreign policy and external relations of states and governments around the world. Today's program is part of this project, and we're grateful to all of you for joining us. Our session today will be exploring Turkey's influence on Bosnian Islam. When it comes to foreign influence in the Balkans, no other country has received quite the attention and scrutiny that Turkey has. Is Turkey returning to the Balkans, or did it never leave the region, even after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the first quarter of the 20th century? In today's conversation, journalist and scholar Harun Karčić will discuss his new short documentary film, Turkey's Influence on Bosnian Islam, Neo-Ottomanism Meets Post-Communism. This film, which was produced by our Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, explores relations between Turkey and Bosnia and Herzegovina since the breakup of Yugoslavia and during the turbulent war years, focusing on their evolution in the post-Civil War period with the rise of the Justice and Development, or AKP, in Ankara. Particular attention is paid to the ways in which Turkey has used Islam to project its soft power influence among Balkan Muslims. Given recent developments in Bosnia, including a new trend of resurgent Serbian nationalism, we'll also, time permitting, explore Harun's thoughts on the broader spectrum of external actors engaged in the former Yugoslavia via religion. So, now to introduce our speaker. Harun Karčić is the editor and host of a foreign affairs show on Al Jazeera's Balkan Languages channel. Over the past decade, he has authored numerous articles on Islam in post-communist Bosnia and Herzegovina and the role played by foreign powers in the region, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and more recently, China and Russia. He also regularly reports on Muslim minorities in Europe and rising right-wing nationalism. This webinar is serving in part as a launch event for the new short documentary of Harun's that we just released. So as he begins his remarks, I will post in the chat box a link to the film on YouTube. This new film is actually a sequel of sorts to a short documentary Harun produced for us earlier this year that explores Saudi Arabia's influence on Islam in Bosnia. I'll put a link to that film in the chat box as well. And of course, I'll also include a link to the main landing page for the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, where you can learn more about the initiative and also access the wide range of articles, working papers, and video recordings of previous talks associated with the project. We're excited that in just a couple of months, Oxford University Press will be publishing an edited volume entitled Wahhabism and the World, Understanding Saudi Arabia's Global Impact on Islam, based on research commissioned and supported by our project. This book will represent the first comprehensive academic study of Saudi religious transnationalism, and it actually features a chapter by our speaker today. Before I hand things over to Harun to get the discussion started, just a few very brief words about logistics and our format today. I wanted to make sure that you're all aware that this webinar is being recorded, and the captioned video will be posted to the event page on the Berkley Center's website soon. If you registered for today's event, you will also receive an email with the captioned video when it becomes available. In the last 15 to 20 minutes or so, we'll have a question and answer and discussion period with you, the audience. You can join the conversation by opening the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and typing your question. And you can enter your question at any point during the seminar. Now, without further ado, let me welcome our guest speaker and hand things over to Harun. Harun, welcome. The floor is yours.
All right, Peter, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here once again. I've been covering foreign influences in the Balkans for the last 10 years. And quite often when fellow journalists or academics from abroad come to visit Bosnia, if they do pay attention to details, they will most likely come across, they'll most likely notice a number of foreign religious influences in the country. Most likely, most often, Turkish religious influence in Bosnia. Most foreigners who travel to this country will notice that quite a number of mosques, old hammams, baths, and or other Ottoman Islamic heritage has been renovated with the generous donations from the Turkish State Development Agency TİKA, or the donations from the Turkish religious authority Diyanet, or from other Turkish cities or municipalities. So in fact, this prompted me to pay much closer attention to Turkish Islamic influence in Bosnia and in the wider Balkan region. Previously, I've studied Saudi and Iranian foreign influences here, so I decided to pay a bit more attention to Turkey's Islamic influence as well. And in order to understand today's Turkish presence in the region, I initially thought, just like quite a number of my fellow journalists, colleagues from the West, I initially thought that Turkey became only present in the region following the coming to power of the AKP power in 2002. However, when I began my research, as I dug deeper into the history of Yugoslav-Turkish relations, I realized that these ties span much further into the past. In fact, I came across information that during the interwar period in the 1930s, high-ranking Turkish government officials visited what was then the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and later on, even after the communist period, they visited the socialist Yugoslavia and made plans for Yugoslav Muslims, actually Yugoslav Turks, whoever, there was a Yugoslav Turkish minority, to enable them to migrate from Yugoslavia into Turkey. There were at least two waves of migration of Yugoslav Muslims from in the 1930s, and then again in the late 50s and early 60s. They were mostly people who declared themselves as ethnic Turks from what is today Kosovo and Northern Macedonia, who, because of the repressive communist regime, decided to seek asylum and seek a better life in Turkey. However, there were also quite a number of Slavic Bosniak Muslims who declared themselves as ethnic Turks so as to have higher chances, better chances of getting an asylum and eventually citizenship of Turkey. But generally, during the Cold War, Yugoslavia and Turkey maintained somewhat lukewarm diplomatic relations. I mean, Turkey was not really all that interested in, the state of Ottoman Islamic heritage and of, old Ottoman era mosques in the country and that sort of thing. They did pave the way. They did allow for ethnic Turks to migrate, but that was about it. It didn't go any deeper than that. Turkey didn't really care to much extent about the general levels of political civil liberties back then in Yugoslavia. However, many things changed following the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1991 and the genocide against the Bosniak Muslims. In fact, I lived in Turkey in the 1990s, and I remember there were numerous conferences and charity drives around Istanbul, which collected donations to help support the Bosnian Muslims. Bosnia was very present in the Turkish media back then in the 1990s. And it's worth mentioning that back then, President Turgut Özal was in power in 1993, and he was from the center-right Motherland Party, the Anavatan Partisi. And in fact, he called for a US-led military intervention to help save Bosnian Muslims. And then similar reactions came from Süleyman Demirel, who was also from the center-right True Path Party, the Doğru Partisi, who served from 1983 onwards. And he too called for a Western-led military intervention to help save Bosnian Muslims. Now we see that it wasn't really only Islamist-led political parties or organizations that were interested in helping save Bosnian Muslims back then. This was a trend among a number of a whole spectrum of different ideological orientations in Turkey. So nationalists were interested, Kemalists were interested in helping, and also Islamist parties such as Necmettin Erbakan and the Milli Görüş movement. They were also very vocal in raising awareness of what was happening in Bosnia and trying to support Bosnian Muslims. However, Turkey's support towards Bosnian Muslims during the 1990s was mostly confined to providing charity. The Turkish military back then was very powerful. It was staunchly secularist, and it did not want to unilaterally act militarily and help save Bosnian Muslims. It decided to work within the frameworks of NATO. So whatever NATO did, Turkey was a part of it, but unilaterally it did not want to act, despite calls from the political elites to intervene in Bosnia. So this was, so the genocide of Bosnian Muslims during the 1990s was an instrumental role, played an instrumental role in galvanizing the Turkish Muslim masses, but also the Muslim masses throughout the Islamic world. And Islamic parties did much to raise awareness of what was happening. The Turkish public very openly sided with Bosnian Muslims, and a lot of humanitarian organizations, they managed to collect large amounts of food and medical supplies for Bosnian Muslims. However, the real change in Turkey's political relations towards Bosnia and the wider Balkan region came in 2002 onwards, with the coming to power of the AK parties. Just give it to illustrate to you the level of change that happened. Back in 2002, Turkish investments in the Western Balkans amounted to a mere 3.6 billion US dollars. And then in 2016, Turkish investments in the Western Balkans amounted to 16.5 billion US dollars. This was the peak. Afterwards, they dropped, but they're still somewhere around 14 billion US dollars. So this was a huge increase in Turkish investments in the region. So if you try to make sense of Turkey's activities in the Balkans, we have to refer to former Foreign Minister and former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who in fact, he was one of the main architects of Turkey's greater engagement, not only in the Balkans, but in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, and in the Middle East as well. So he in fact decided that Turkey should open up its formerly self-centered foreign policy towards the regions that it bordered. As you know, back then in the 1950s, in 1960s, Turkey was very close. It was in very bad relations with Iraq, with Syria, with Iran, and it was turned exclusively towards the West. So when Davutoğlu came to power, he decided to increase both Turkey's soft power, both Turkey's bilateral trade, and foreign direct investments with countries that it bordered with. So with Syria, with whom Turkey shares a 400-kilometer long border, with Iraq, with Iran, but also with Balkan countries such as Greece, Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. From 2002 onwards, with the coming to party of the AKP, they began becoming much more present in the Balkans. So depending on which country we talk about, Turkey had different approaches. So, for example, when it approached Muslim majority countries such as Bosnia, Kosovo, or Albania, Turkey, talked about the shared Ottoman history, the Islamic ties that bind them, kinship, and Turkey being a protector state of Balkan Muslims. When it approached Orthodox Christian countries such as Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, or Serbia, Turkey talked about, having friendly, neighborly ties, investments, bilateral trade, and common economic interests. It wasn't as if Turkey had a common policy towards the region. It was very pragmatic, and it was tailor-made for every particular country. And many people ask me, to what extent is Islam a player in Turkey's foreign policy? This is a very tricky question to answer. I would still say that when countries that do have a Muslim majority population, Turkey tries to somewhat accentuate the Islamic ties between itself and the Balkan country that's in question. However, if you look at official government statistics from Ankara, Turkey has far higher, larger bilateral trade with non-Muslim countries such as Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia than it has with Muslim majority countries such as Kosovo, Bosnia, or Albania. Just to illustrate to you, I will show you a number. Turkey has in Serbia 400 registered companies. There are 400 registered Turkish-owned companies in Serbia, which is a Christian majority country. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a Muslim majority country, there are barely 40 registered Turkish companies. So clearly, Islam is not a driving factor when it comes to investments in the region. So, so pragmatism is definitely. So how does Turkey view the Balkans? Many Turkish officials and intellectuals that I spoke to, they see the Balkans as their natural hinterland. But then if you speak to people from different political parties, if you speak to people from the AKP, they see the Balkans as, in very romantic terms, as the lost Ottoman territories, which they do not want to necessarily regain, but they want to definitely have a greater presence in. If you speak to Turkish officials or intellectuals who are close to the GHP, the Kemalist party, formed by the Republican People's Party, they're very sentimentally associated with the Balkans, because Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey, was in fact born in what is today Greece, in Thessaloniki, and he was educated in Bitola, which is a small town in northern Macedonia. So he in fact grew up. He attended a secondary military school in today's North Macedonia. So he was from the Balkans. So people from the Kemalist Republican People's Party are, this is their association with the Balkans. And if you speak to people from politicians from the nationalist MHP, the MHP party, they have they too have sometimes have expansionist views, and they consider the Balkans to be also their own natural hinterland, where Turkey should have a greater political and even military presence. So whoever you speak to each and every group in Turkey, the Balkans is definitely very, very important. And if you speak to Balkan Muslims, and if you ask them how do they perceive Turkish Islamic influence, and this is I ask this question quite often to my fellow Bosnian Muslims, because after the collapse of Yugoslavia, we saw an increase in Gulf interpretations, precisely in Saudi interpretations of Islam, in Turkish interpretations of Islam, and in Iranian interpretations of Islam. And perhaps it's worth mentioning here, why did we see such a large number of foreign Islamic influences? Well, back in the 1990s, when the war and genocide against Bosnian Muslims began, the Bosnian Muslim government was under a UN-backed embargo, so it was not allowed to import weapons to defend itself. And of course, Western European countries were not too interested in providing aid of that sort. They did provide humanitarian food aid, but not weapons. So the legitimate government and the internationally recognized government led by Bosnian Muslims turned towards the Middle East. And Middle Eastern countries were quite happy to jump in and help. So help was provided by the Saudis, by the Emiratis, by the Iranians, and a number of other countries. Towards the end of the war, the Turkish military, in cooperation with the US, also was involved in supplying weapons. But it was mostly the Gulf Arab countries that were involved. And after the war, these countries that helped Bosnians during the war decided that they wanted to play some sort of a role in the post-communist reconstruction of Bosnia, which they did, because the Bosnian government was more than happy to allow them to reconstruct the country, to reconstruct destroyed hospitals, schools, roads, housing, and also mosques. More than 600 mosques were destroyed during the war. So the Bosnian Muslim government was more than happy to accept donations from Muslim majority countries, from Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Qatar, the Emirates, Morocco, to help renovate and restore these damaged and destroyed mosques. So these countries, not only did these Muslim majority countries, apart from renovating and rebuilding destroyed Islamic heritage, they also wanted to exert their religious soft power among Bosnian Muslims, who were back then, after having lived in a communist atheist country for about 50 years, they were experiencing some sort of an Islamic revival. They were returning back to their religion in the post post-communist and post-war years. So they were in search of answers pertaining to their religion, and these foreign Muslim countries were willing to provide such answers. So we saw a number of preachers coming from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, from the Emirates, from Qatar. In Bosnia, we saw Iranian Shia preachers being active in Bosnia. We saw various Turkish jamaats or congregations and non-governmental pious foundations also being active in Bosnia in the post-war years. So of course, towards after the initial honeymoon, which lasted perhaps until 2001, 2002, Bosnian Muslims began sort of rejecting or looking negatively towards foreign religious influences, particularly towards the Saudi Wahhabi influences in Bosnia, later on towards the Iranians as well. So Turkey was more or less, actually more than any other foreign influence, the Turkish interpretations of Islam were accepted by Bosnian Muslims. Why? Because it's quite simple. Bosnia was, for at least nearly 500 years, part of the Ottoman Empire. The Bosnian interpretation of Islam is almost exactly the same as the Turkish interpretation of Islam. The mosques, most of the mosques built in Bosnia were built during the Ottoman period. There was a lot of overlapping similarities in the cultural understanding, in the traditional understanding of Islam, and in the daily practice of Islam between Bosnian Muslims and Turks. So what Turks did when they came to Bosnia, Turkish governmental and non-governmental organizations. When I say governmental, I mean organizations such as Diyanet or the Yunus Emre Center or TİKA, the Turkish State Development Agency. What they did was they just tried to, they either built new mosques according to the existing traditional architecture of Bosnia, or they renovated Ottoman era mosques. So this was a welcome move by local Bosnian Muslims. What the Saudis and the other Gulf countries would mostly do was they would build mosques which are architecturally completely different from other Bosnian mosques. So this didn't go down too well with the average Bosnian Muslim. They were happy that Muslim countries were helping rebuild mosques, but they simply didn't like the style, and they didn't like the sort of aggressive proselytizing by a number of Saudi preachers, especially in the immediate post-war years. So Turkish influence, Islamic influence was in a way welcomed by Bosnian Muslims, and of course, along with Turkish Islamic influences, trade increased. The Turkish government, the Turkish embassy in Bosnia and in the Balkans generally, they would provide numerous scholarships for Bosnian Muslims to go abroad and study in Turkey, not only theological studies, but also any other, engineering, IT, economics, law, and so on and so forth. Unlike the Saudis, Egyptians, and Iranians, who would mostly provide scholarships for Bosnian Muslims to study theology exclusively. Turkey was far more open. It provided more opportunities for Bosnian Muslims. You could choose whatever you wanted to study. So this was of course welcomed by Bosnian Muslims. When it comes, in the Turkish, before I move on to this, when we talk about the Saudis and Salafi Wahhabi organizations which were active in Bosnia in the post-war years, they mostly ignored, or they were on bad relations with the existing Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is the official organization in charge of interpreting Islam in the country. It's similar to the Diyanet in Turkey, except that the Diyanet is a state-backed, state-owned. It's a state organization, whilst the Islamic community in Bosnia is highly autonomous. It's self-financed, and it appoints all its imams or religious leaders throughout the country, and it's in charge of handling and keeping under control all the mosques throughout the country. The Salafi Wahhabi organizations had rather tense relations with the Islamic community over the last 20 years. However, Turkey was very respectful of the Islamic community in Bosnia, and all the support that it provided towards Bosnian Muslims, it made sure that it went through through official channels. So if it wanted to renovate a mosque, or say, or any other a cultural Islamic cultural heritage site in the country. It would first approach the Islamic community of Bosnia, sign an MOU with them, work together with them, make sure the funds were transferred to the Islamic community. So it showed a lot of respect for the existing Islamic community, whereas the Salafi Wahhabi organizations did not show any respect, and they even at times they accused the Islamic community of practicing what they called "quote unquote" communist Islam. So, of course, from the perspective of the Islamic community, Turkey was a welcome partner in reconstructing destroyed and damaged Ottoman Islamic cultural sites in the country, and also in helping strengthen the Islamic community in Bosnia. So this was the case with Bosnia. If you look at other countries in the region, Turkey had a very similar approach to, say, the Muslim minority living in Serbia, in the region of Sanjak, to the Muslims living in Montenegro, in Kosovo, and in Croatia. The Turkish approach towards Muslim minorities in the Eastern Balkans, in Greece, and in Bulgaria and Romania was somewhat different. Why? Well, because Bulgaria the Muslims in Bulgaria are mostly ethnic Turks or Pomaks. So the ethnic Turks, of course, they are Turkish speakers. They are a Turkish-speaking minority. The same is the case with the Muslim minority in Greece, in what is in the region known as Western Thrace, which is also inhabited by ethnic Turks. There are about 200,000 to 300,000 of them, and also in Romania, in the region of Dobruja. So these are also a Turkish-speaking minority. In these countries, the approach is different. Turkey is far more active there. Turkey, in fact, in Greece and in Bulgaria, appoints its own imams or religious leaders who are appointed by the Diyanet or by the Diyanet's coordinator embedded with the Turkish embassy. In fact, Turkey also, the Diyanet publishes and distributes its religious education books to these Turkish Muslim minorities in Bulgaria, Greece, and Romania. It is far more present there. So it's a different approach with the ethnic Turkish minorities, and it is a different approach with the Slavic Muslim communities living in what is known as the former Yugoslavia. And if you look from the perspective of Balkan Muslims, I mean, why is Turkey viewed with such a high level of sympathy? Well, look at it this way. The Balkans was a part of the Ottoman Empire for many, many years. At one point in time, in the late 18th century, according to the US historian Justin McCarthy, there was at least 60% of the Balkan population was Muslim. Today, this figure has dropped to about 6 or 7%. So a vast majority of Balkan Muslims have been expelled during the 19th century or massacred with the creation of nation states. So with the creation of every nation state, be it Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, Romania, Muslims were expelled. Not only, so when I say Muslims, I don't mean only the Ottoman administrators in the military that was present there, but these Balkan Christian countries in the 19th century viewed their Muslim populations as the physical remnants of the much detested Ottoman Empire. So when they fought their wars of independence in the 19th century and gained independence, not only did they expel the Ottoman administration and the Ottoman military, they also, in almost every case, expelled the local Muslim population, which was more often than not of a Slavic origin. They were ethnic Slavic Muslims. They were not Ottomans at all. But in the eyes of the Christian populations, they were seen as belonging to the Ottoman state. They were seen as the physical remnants of the Ottoman state. And then in every successive, every time there was a major war in the Balkans, be it the Balkan Wars of 1912 or 1913, the First World War, the Second World War, Balkan Muslims mostly fled to the nearest, safest Muslim majority country, and this was Turkey. So of course, so this is perhaps the reason why Balkan Muslims view Turkey in a favorable way. although I must say that Turkish influence in the Balkans still has its limitations, in the sense that perhaps Balkan Muslims have been expecting much more from Turkey than Turkey was willing to provide. Let me give you just an example. Right now, Bosnia is facing the biggest political and security crisis since the end of the war, since 1995. Western diplomats and security analysts are increasingly talking of the possibility of the country breaking apart and a new war erupting. Despite all the talk over the last 10 to 15 years about Turkey being a major supporter of Balkan Muslims, Turkey reacted to this ongoing crisis in a very, very mild way. In fact, there was only one belated reaction from the Turkish government, calling for a very, very mild reaction towards a major crisis in Bosnia, calling for all sides to de-escalate and to find a common solution. So Turkey did not step openly on the side of Bosnian Muslims, despite Bosnian Muslims expecting such a reaction from Turkey, thinking that Turkey was their major ally. So here we see to what extent Turkish influence in the Balkans is limited, has its limitations, and that Turkey is very pragmatic and it's very careful when it deals with Balkans. It has excellent relations with Serbia. At the same time, when Serbia is working on destabilizing Bosnia through its proxies, through Milorad Dodik and the Republic of Srpska, Turkey is very careful to walk a very fine line between not openly supporting Bosnian Muslims, but making various declarations which are very watered down declarations, which call for restraint on all sides of the country. So it's again we are focused today on Turkey, but I hope that in today's session we'll have time to speak about other foreign influences in the region. At the same time, while Turkey has been present in the Western Balkans in Muslim majority countries, Russia has also been increasing its influence in the region. They have, through the Russian Orthodox Church, been waging quite a significant disinformation campaign against NATO, against the US, against the EU, and they have been working on destabilizing quite a number of Balkan countries. As you know, the Russian Orthodox Church is very closely connected to the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is present in Bosnia, in Serbia, and in Montenegro, and Russia has really been using these channels to exert its influence over the last couple of years. So I hope Peter will have time to discuss this issue as well. I think I've more or less managed to cover in these 15 minutes the most important points of Turkey's Islamic religious soft power in the Western Balkans. As in every lecture, the best part is the Q&A session. This is now we have an opportunity to discuss certain issues in more detail. So I really look forward to the questions from our audience.
Great, Harun. Thank you so much. You always give us so much food for thought and such sort of comprehensive and thoughtful presentations. I want to remind our audience that if you have a question for Harun, you can ask it by using the Q&A box. That's just a button on your main Zoom control panel. You can press it and a window will pop up and you can type your question directly there. Harun, I actually did want to pick up on the point where you ended, really. You mentioned, of course, that many of us have been keeping a close and concerned eye on Bosnia and Herzegovina recently, precisely because of this new wave of instability and tension. You have mentioned that there are a wide range of external actors that are involved in this situation, including Russia. And I'm sure that many in our audience today are familiar with the kind of ongoing partnership between the Kremlin and particularly the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the way that that fits into various aspects of Russian foreign policy today. You alluded to the idea that there may be some relevant connections between the Russian Orthodox Church and current trends in resurgent Serbian nationalism in Bosnia. And so I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about the actual textures of that and the kind of forms that it takes, and how you see kind of the kind of Moscow's role evolving in this respect over time.
Peter, in all post-communist countries in Central and Eastern Europe, religion serves as a means of reclaiming lost identity and regaining forgotten heritage and historical memory. So this is indeed the case with the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe. The entire story of Russian influence in the Balkans, this has been going on for at least the past two centuries, since the Ottoman-Russian Wars of 1876. However, things became far more serious after the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the Russian proxy wars against Ukraine in Donbass, Lugansk regions, which are still ongoing. And now, as we speak, we see a massing of Russian troops on Ukraine's eastern border. So why is Russia interested in the Balkans? Well, as the US, this is really again related to the US, to NATO's expansion towards the east. Russia did not like the fact that NATO has been encroaching into what it considers its own territory in Eastern Europe. So when Poland joined NATO, and the Baltic countries joined NATO and became very pro-Western, Moscow viewed this as an encroachment onto its own sphere of influence. And as Ukraine and Georgia were making great steps towards joining the EU and NATO, this was a red alarm, it was a red flag for Moscow. So Moscow decided to support separatist movements in South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, and thereby effectively preventing Georgia from joining NATO. Same was the case, that was back in 2008. In 2014, it did the same with Ukraine. So then, the last 5 to 6 years, Moscow decided to punch Europe's soft underbelly, which is the Balkans. The Balkans are, there are a number of EU and NATO member states in the Balkans. So one of them is Croatia, which is a NATO and EU member state. Bulgaria is another NATO and EU member state. So is Greece, and so is Romania and Slovenia. So Moscow decided that if it can sow chaos in countries where there are existing ethnic tensions, such as Bosnia, Kosovo, or Montenegro, then it can keep the keep the EU and NATO occupied in this part of the region, create them another problem so they can deal with, be more focused on this region, while Moscow deals with countries which are far more important for them, such as Ukraine or the Caucasus. So over the last couple of years, there were a number of serious allegations. For example, there was a failed coup attempt in Montenegro in 2016, right before Montenegro joined NATO. And this was the state prosecutor of Montenegro accused Moscow and two agents of Russia's GRU military intelligence service of being part of this conspiracy to overthrow the democratically elected pro-Western government in Montenegro. This failed, and eventually Montenegro joined NATO. However, there was significant evidence showing that the Russian Orthodox Church was in contact with the Serbian Orthodox Church in Montenegro, and that perhaps it even funneled certain amounts of cash into Montenegro to help finance this attempted coup against the government of that country. And as you know, the Orthodox Church It's highly autonomous, and it's not really subject to a lot of legal oversight as religious organizations may be in the US. So it really functions in a somewhat murky gray zone. So it's really difficult to follow the money trail of where money comes from. But there is significant evidence to suggest that it came from Moscow. And of course, we have seen it on a number of occasions, President Putin talking about the importance of the Serbian Orthodox Church. He and the Serbia's president, Aleksandar Vučić, visiting various Christian Orthodox sites in Serbia, in Belgrade, and so on and so forth. The same was the case with the Orthodox Church in Kosovo and in Montenegro. And we have also seen a number of non-state Russian, pro-Russian organizations being very active in the Balkans, mostly disguised as either biker gangs, such as the Night Wolves, which were very active in Crimea and Ukraine during the 2014 crisis, which also have a branch in Bosnia and in Serbia. And very often you can find photographs of them with priests from the Serbian Orthodox Church, or with members of a visiting delegations from the Russian Orthodox Church. So we see very close ties between the Russian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, right-wing Serbian politicians, and a number of non-governmental organizations which are active in the region. And of course, a number of Western analysts that I've been in contact with have told me that this modus operandi of the Kremlin in the Balkans is nothing new. It's in fact the same approach has been applied to other East European countries, more particularly to Ukraine. So they're applying the same modus operandi in the Balkans as well, in the hope of destabilizing countries which are pro-Western, such as Bosnia, which is in countries which aim to join NATO. And in fact, there was a research, an opinion poll carried out in 2018 by the International Republican Institute in their offices in the Balkans, which found out that a vast majority of all the different ethnic groups in Bosnia, of Serbs, Croats, and Bosniak Muslims, I think about 75% of Bosniak Muslims were pro-American. So the largest percentage compared to any other ethnic group in the region. So Bosnian Muslims are clearly very pro-Western. So are Kosovo Albanians. Why? Well, because even though the US may not have the best reputation in the Middle East, in the case of the Balkans, American Jews have a very, very positive reputation. This is because during the wars of the 1990s, it was the US-led NATO military intervention which helped save, although belatedly, helped save Bosnian Muslims by bombing Serb targets in 1995. And also in the case of Kosovo, in 1999, this was led by Madeleine Albright, who was back then the Secretary of State. And in fact, in Bosnia, there were at least 60,000 NATO troops stationed after the war, mostly Americans. And in Kosovo today, you still have about 5,000 to 6,000 American troops at Camp Bondsteel. So Kosovo Muslims and Bosnian Muslims are very, very grateful to the United States. They have a very positive opinion of the US, which may not be the case with other Muslims in the Middle East, but in the Balkans, it definitely is. So Moscow is aware of this. And in an attempt to derail Bosnia's NATO integration and its pro-Western orientation, it tries to strengthen Serbian nationalists and the Serbian Orthodox Church by either directly supporting them, financing them, or running its very well orchestrated disinformation campaign in the region, which again lionized Vladimir Putin, provide a very anti-American, anti-NATO, anti-EU stance. And this has only been increasing over the last couple of years.
Okay, great. Thanks, Harun. So we've got some questions coming in. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given recent developments, a lot of our audience members do have questions about things that are going on in Bosnia today. But I'm going to start with one that is asking about current developments, but also interestingly linking it back to the historical context of Turkey's engagement in Bosnia. And this is actually two questions, I think perhaps coming from the same member of our audience, that I'll kind of combine together in one. So the question is, how does Turkey's imperial history in the Balkans impact its role in Bosnia? For instance, if Turkey gets involved at a time of crisis like last month, is it harder for Turkey to have a stabilizing effect on the situation? And in your view, did Turkey have an impact on the reported instability in Bosnia this past month? And if so, what kind of impact?
Yeah. The Turkish president visited Bosnia, Recep Tayyip Erdogan visited Bosnia a couple of months ago. And he, in fact, the thing is, although Bosnian Muslims may want to see Turkey being more openly pro-Bosniak, this is not Ankara's really position. Ankara wants to support all three sides in Bosnia, and they want to support Bosnia's state institutions, which of course encompass Bosnian Serbs, Croats, and Bosniak Muslims. So when Erdogan was in Bosnia recently, he said, whatever you guys decide among yourselves, Ankara will support you, but you have to agree upon this among yourselves. We are more than willing to be an honest broker, but we will not support any side particularly. We'll support whatever all three sides agree upon. Well, although this was in a way welcomed by some, it pretty much stopped there. We didn't see any further involvement from Turkey later on. Of course, Turkey has far more pressing issues now. The lira, it has an ailing economy. The lira has been depreciating. It's far more interested in mending ties with the United Arab Emirates, Israel, or Egypt. Only recently we saw a high-profile visit by Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, the first such visit in the last 10 years. Turkey President Erdogan announced a return visit to Abu Dhabi in February next year. He's also hinted at possible visits to Egypt, or at least amending thawing ties with Egypt and Israel. So with whom Turkey has a far greater economic interest in bilateral trade than it has with Bosnia. So I wouldn't say Bosnia is really on a high priority list for Turkey, but definitely some things, if things do escalate in Bosnia, because of the sentimental relations between Bosnian Muslims and the Turkish public, the Turkish president will be obliged to react in some way. But we still haven't reached that point. Turkey has not made any promises to the Bosnian Muslims particularly. There were no promises, as in providing military support or anything of that sort. They did promise to support the armed forces, the unified armed forces of Bosnia, which include all three ethnic groups. So Turkey's approach is that Turkey wants a united Bosnia. They don't want Bosnia to break up. And they have, over the last 20 years, Turkey's stance towards Bosnia has been to support Bosnia's NATO and EU integration. Whereas compared to Russia or even China, they've been pretty much against this. So I wouldn't say Turkey has had any sort of destabilizing role in the current situation in Bosnia. This can only be attributed to neighboring Serbia and Russia. This is in fact Russia's hybrid war, which is being led in the Balkans, and also at the same time on the Belarusian-Polish border with the migrant crisis, so as to keep the EU busy on two different fronts.
Okay, great. Harun, where you ended there is actually a perfect segue in many ways to this next question, which is precisely about potential scenarios that could emerge out of an escalation of the current tensions. So the question reads, we've seen that the West, and especially the EU, is alarmed at the recent separatist rhetoric, but there hasn't been much diplomatic intervention or explicit censoring of Dodik. If this situation does continue to escalate, which countries will Bosnia realistically be able to turn to for allies? At what point will the West finally be pushed to get involved?
You know what, Peter? I mean, back in the 1990s, it was a whole different world, Back then, the Cold War had just ended. Liberal democracy had triumphed over communism. Bosnian Muslims were seen as being secular, multi-ethnic, pro-Western, fighting against the remnants of a former communist turned nationalist Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia. So Bosnian Muslims had a very good reputation in the West. In fact, I had a look at some of the articles published by the New York Times and what the Post back in the 1990s. Bosnian Muslims were always presented in a very positive light. However, things change. I mean, Europe generally, everything changed after the 9/11 attacks. You know, the 9/11 attacks and the spate of suicide bombings by extremists, Islamist extremist organizations throughout Europe and the US. In London 2005, then in Paris and so on and so forth, in Berlin. And this really changed the perception of Muslims, including the perception of white Muslims in the Balkans, of Slavic Muslims in Bosnia. And so Europe began viewing Muslims through a security perspective. It became far more Islamophobic. Right-wing political parties came to power. And then again, in 2014 and 2015, there were a couple of hundred Balkan Muslims who joined ISIL. And though they were only a fraction of the entire Balkan Muslim population, this was mostly picked up and enlarged, accentuated by Western media outlets that in some way, either purposely or accidentally, he almost presented Balkan Muslims as being a hotbed of Islamic extremism. Although these Muslims had lived in a communist, although they're known for being non-religious and who had lived in a communist country for nearly 50 years. However, this is the reputation that Balkans Muslims have been receiving in Western media outlets over the last 10 to 15 years. And of course, I absolutely understand this sort of these perceptions. Even before these Balkan Muslims joined ISIL in 2014 and 15, as in every post-communist country, there's been a religious revival of sort. And the religious revival in the Balkans, among Balkan Muslims particularly, saw an increased number of Balkan Muslim women wearing headscarves, Balkan Muslim men growing beards, a greater mosque attendance, and so on and so forth. So some international media outlets, particularly Western, view this through a suspicious lens. So this really changed the perception of Bosnian Muslims. I'm afraid that in case a new war breaks out, Bosnian Muslims will not have any real allies. Back in the 1990s, Iran wanted to help Bosnian Muslims. That was nearly 30 years ago. It had its own interests, of course. But today, Iran is overstretched. They are very present in Syria, very present in Iraq with their Hashd al-Shabi paramilitary forces, very present in Lebanon and in Yemen. I doubt that they'll be willing to help Bosnian Muslims, and I doubt that Bosnian Muslims will be willing to ask for any more Iranian help, because this created a lot of diplomatic trouble for the Bosnian Muslim, the moderate Bosnian Muslim government during and after the war, because it had to prove itself to the its Western partners that it wasn't radical as Iran was. Then the Saudis, who also provided significant support, financial support, and other Gulf countries in general to the Bosnian Muslims back in the 1990s, they are today in a different situation. The price of oil has significantly dropped over the last 30 years. The Saudis themselves are now in their own troubles. There's been an economic stagnation. For the first time, they began slapping the income taxes to their populations, then the value-added taxes as well. So they're definitely looking for ways to earn extra money to fill state coffers and fill the gap, which they apparently cannot fill with the drop in oil prices. Turkey has its own troubles, of course, with the depreciating lira, and it's trying to mend ties with other more important players. Western European countries have sent not second but third grade political negotiators to help find a solution in the country. So clearly, the Balkans is really not a high priority on their agenda. And so Bosnian Muslims today are in a rather difficult situation. I'm even afraid to think of what would the worst case scenario be should a war break out. The good thing is that at least the Biden administration has some knowledge of the Balkans. Biden himself was very vocal in the 1990s, as were a number of Jewish American congressmen who lobbied for a greater U.S. intervention in the Balkans. But again, now the U.S. is far more occupied with an ever more assertive Russia and a rising China. The U.S. military is transferring, I think, 40% or 60% of its assets towards the Asia-Pacific region. I'm not sure really to what extent they will be interested in the region. The only thing that can perhaps draw the U.S. to be more involved in the Balkans is if they understand that this is, if they begin perceiving events as being the result of Putin's hybrid warfare, that what is happening in the Balkans is no different from what is happening in Ukraine or from what is happening on the Belarusian-Polish border. If the U.S. understands the seriousness of this situation, if they do understand that this is straight out of the Kremlin's playbook, then there's a chance that the U.S. will take this situation far more seriously and perhaps intervene, increase their military and diplomatic presence in the Balkans, particularly in Bosnia, and prevent a further escalation of the situation. For if a war breaks out in Bosnia, it will not stay in Bosnia. It will have a spillover effect, which will include neighboring Serbia, because neighboring Serbia will jump in to help their Serbian brothers, right? Neighboring Croatia, which will jump in to help ethnic Croats living in Bosnia. And Croatia is a NATO and EU member state. You'll have at least a couple of 100,000 refugees fleeing across the border. This will affect Slovenia, Austria, Germany, and so on and so forth. We'll see how things develop. I do hope that they can find a political solution to the ongoing stalemate. But of course, anything is possible at this moment.
Thank you, Harun. Definitely worrying times. So there's still 3 more questions I want to try to get through, but in the interest of time, since we're getting close to the hour mark, what I'll do is I'll ask all 3 of them at the same time and then hand back to you to respond to whichever of them you would like to. One of them kind of continues the focus on current nationalist separatist trends, whereas the other 2 kind of are asking more generally about aspects of Turkish religious engagement with the Balkans. So this first question is asking whether any of the outside actors associated with nationalism, such as the night wolves, do they contribute to the current instability, conflict, and especially hate crimes that we're seeing in Bosnia? So that's question 1. The second question notes the points that you made about the kind of natural affinities between religious culture in Turkey and religious culture in Bosnia and other parts of the Balkans. And so this person is asking whether Islam in Albania and Kosovo are also experiencing the similar kind of natural acceptance or affinities with Turkish Islam. And then the final question is asking about the impact of the Fethullah Gülen movement in Bosnia and Bosnian Islam. What has been the effect of the Turkish government's targeting of Gülenists in terms of its engagement with Bosnia?
Right. Let me start with the last question. A couple of years ago, when Recep Tayyip Erdogan visited Bosnia, he asked the Bosnian member of the presidency, Bakir Izetbegović, to arrest members of the Gülen movement in Bosnia and to extradite them to Turkey. As you know, there's a university in Sarajevo, which is affiliated with the Gülen movement, the International Burç University. There are a number of, I think, 2 high schools and a number of non-governmental organizations. Most of them have changed their names after the 2016 failed coup d'etat in Turkey. So when President Erdogan asked the Bosniak Muslim member of the presidency, Bakir Izetbegović, to arrest and extradite these members of the Gülen movement, Erdogan did not really understand to what extent how Bosnia functions. Bosnia it's not a very centralized state like Turkey. A member of the presidency cannot simply ordered the police to arrest somebody and deport him. Bosnia has a multi-layer, 3 different layers of governance. So the Bosnian member, there's a rotating 3-member tripartite presidency, which has sort of a coordinating role. It's very similar to the organization of Switzerland. There are numerous cantons which are very, very autonomous. So the president of a country cannot order any particular canton, which is a small sort of a province, to arrest or extradite anybody. Of course, nobody was arrested, nobody was extradited, no member of the Gulen movement was extradited from Bosnia. And this did not go down too well in Ankara. So relations between Erdogan and the Bosniak Muslim member of the presidency, the former Bakir Izetbegovic, declined. They cooled off for a while, and we didn't see any major improvements afterwards. So apparently Turkey was expecting much more from the Bosnian Muslim side, but it didn't get what expected. What Turkey wanted from Bosnian Muslims was what it got from from countries such as Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan or Somalia. If it ordered somebody to be arrested and deported, that's what it got. This is possible in centralized states. In Bosnia, which has a multi-layered system of governance, which has no matter it might have it might be in its deepest political and security crisis in the last 25 years, but it still has an effective rule of law system, which prevents anybody from just being arbitrarily arrested and deported. The second question, when it comes to religious affinities between Turkey and Albania and Kosovo, yes, in my conversations with Albanian and Kosovar Muslims who have also experienced the different situations with Saudi-inspired Salafi Wahhabi movements influence in the late 1990s, they also welcomed a greater Turkish Islamic presence since from 2002 onwards. Turkey pretty much had the same approach in Kosovo, Albania as it did in Bosnia. So it renovated or restored old mosques, Turkish, madrasas, bridges, caravansarais, hammams, and so on and so forth. So this was more or less welcomed by these Muslim Islamic communities in Kosovo and in Albania, and they still continue to have a very, very strong ties with Ankara, with Diyanet. They exchange numerous reciprocal visits among themselves. They provide scholarships for Albanian and Kosovar Muslims to study theology and other subjects in Turkey. Of course, they provide any other sort of support, financial or logistical support that is necessary for these Muslims in the Balkans. And as far as the Night Wolves are concerned, yes, there have been a number of articles. So the Night Wolves are a right-wing nationalist organization in Russia, which has its chapters in Bosnia and in Serbia. They are very close to the Kremlin. They are very close to the Russian Orthodox Church. They have their presence in the region. They have a number of non-governmental organizations which function here. A couple of years ago, there was a major article which an investigative story which uncovered a number of photographs of members of the Night Wolves posing with assault rifles in Bosnia, being very close to their Serbian nationalists, particularly to Milorad Dodik, who is the secessionist leader of Bosnian Serbs. They've also been photographed with the members of the Serbian and Russian Orthodox Church. So they do have a presence in the region. What this will develop into, I'm not sure at the moment, but we know from the Crimean scenario that members of the Night Wolves, in fact, took part in the conflict in Crimea and also in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass and Lugansk, and they actually took part in this region. There were numerous Serb volunteers who also traveled to Ukraine, and there was even a documentary done by Vice News talking about the presence of Serbian volunteers in Crimea. So these ties are well documented, they are well established, and it clearly shows Russia's interests and its ability to destabilize the region, not only through official channels such as politicians or the Orthodox Church, but also through non-official channels such as the Night Wolves.
Thanks, Harun. Really, really helpful responses. Well, we have reached the end of our time today, unfortunately. I want to first and foremost thank Dr. Harun Karčić for his remarks
Thank
and
you.
for prompting such a rich and wide-ranging discussion, Harun. It's always great to hear and learn from you.
Thank you.
So if the short film and our discussion today left you wanting more, you're actually in luck, because there's actually a third installment of this trilogy of films. This one focused on Iran's religious influence in Bosnia, once again, written and directed by Harun, that we will be releasing early next year. So please stay tuned for more information about that. As ever, my thanks to Ruth Gopin, who coordinates all our events here at the Berkley Center, and to all the rest of the center staff for making these sessions possible. And finally, let me thank all of you for joining us today. Take care, and I hope to see you at another of our events very soon. Bye, everyone.